Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot daf lamed chet. This week's learning is sponsored by Nora Feldman in loving memory of her mother, Faye Derek Zichrona Lebracha, on her third yahrzeit. She was a dedicated Hadron learner and continues to inspire us with her curiosity and love of learning each day. We miss her deeply. Today's daf is sponsored by Sarah and Danny Borelowitz in honor of the Hanachat tefillin of their grandson Yishai Matalon in Hebron at Kever Yishai. So wonderful to be learning about tefillin as Yishai approaches his special day. Result. Okay, we're going to get started with the second version of the story that we saw yesterday. So we were talking about Rav Ashi. He was walking home on Shabbat. His tzitzit tore. Ravina was walking after him, saw they tore, didn't say anything. When he got home, he told Rav Ashi that, oh, way back there, your tzitzit had torn. And Rav Ashi said, why don't you tell me then? And he said, if I would, right, he said, I would have taken them off, right? He said, if I would have taken them off, and then he said, because remember, you have to remember in those days, it's not like today where you're wearing tzitzit and something over it. That was all he was wearing. He said, well, Ravina said, you obviously didn't have to take them off because gadol kevod haberiyot shedochet lo taseh Shabbat Torah. And then they say, right, but it doesn't, and that, right, so they say, Turgumar Rav Roshva, it doesn't actually override the mitzvah of Shabbat. Okay, because the issue of Shabbat is d'oraita, and it only overrides d'Rabbanan. So really, he would have had to take it off, and Rav Ashi was basically saying, why didn't you tell me? In version 2, Ikada Amre, Mehatam Amrle. Actually, Ravina mentioned it back at the beginning. And then Amrle, and Rav Ashi's reaction is, why are you telling me this? Lemishdiye, because I have to take it off. V'ha'amar gadol kevod haberiyot shedochet lo taseh Shabbat Torah. But why are you telling me I have to take it off? Right? Now, Ravina never said you had to take it off, but sounded like he was saying you must be telling me because you think I have to take it off. But what happened to kevod haberiyot? Okay, where it's flipped, who says what? Then the Gemara seems to be responding here. Like, we don't understand the story. Didn't he explain that it was only about the lav of lo tasur, meaning it only affects the Rabbanans, but it doesn't override things that are Torah law? And then, right, that doesn't make any sense in the story. How did Rav Ashi say I don't have to take it off because it shouldn't override a d'oraita kevod haberiyot? To which they answer, Hachanami Karmelita Rabbanani. Oh, wait. Until now, we thought it was a d'oraita carrying on Shabbat because it was carrying in the public domain. But now they say, no, who says it was the public domain? It was a Karmelit. Right, remember from Eruvin and Shabbat, we learned a lot about a Karmelit. It's an in-between space where it's not Reshut Rabim d'oraita, but it's a big enough space and where a lot of people come that it's already considered like a Reshut Rabim b'derabbanan. So basically, it's forbidden to carry there on a rabbinic level, and that's why he said, I don't have to take it off. I can carry it on Shabbat for that reason. Okay, and with that, Hadran alacha kometz. Okay, there's a lot of questions about the story. How could he wear a garment that we only have 3 tzitziot on it? That's another issue. Isn't that being overridden by what we said, and then it's a problem? They say, well, there's distinctions made between shev al taseh, that maybe in a d'oraita, if you just don't do anything, it works, okay? Like by not taking it off. Anyway, there's more discussion here. There's things that aren't said in the sugya that the commentaries comment on, but we're gonna move on. Okay, starting a new chapter. I just want to get some order here about the chapter. We went back to this yesterday, so it should be in your head already, which is we started with on daf kavchet with this Mishna, or we really started before, with a list of all sorts of things that are not ma'akevin, that are ma'akev ze'etzeh. You can't have, right, a candelabra without all the seven branches, and you can't have this without that, right? We went we started with all the Menachot. From there, we moved on to other topics like the menorah and mezuzah and tefillin and tzitzit. Now, the next chapter continues this, but starts off with things that are not ma'akev ze'etzeh. And it starts with techelet, it goes to tefillin. Okay, we're going to get back to menachot in this list, and animals and sacrifices and things like that. So that's where we're going right now. So we're going to start with techelet. Okay, let's just talk about the word techelet and what techelet is. Okay, there's an organization called Ptil Techelet, and I'm going to put a link on the website today to send you to their website to kind of see some of the things that they have. They also have, I see Julie shaking her head. Julie's done a lot of research into techelet. She's showing us now in the Zoom. Now, there's been a lot of research done, especially, throughout time, okay, where people try to say, oh, I've discovered what real techelet is. So nowadays there's an organization called Techelet, and they basically make techelet, they make the dye. They found what they believe is the chilazon, the snail, from where we get the techelet color, the dye. There's a lot of information there. They even have a pamphlet that's specifically made for Daf Yomi learners with lots of things that relate to things we're learning in the Daf. So, and by the way, if you're in Israel and you want to go on a tour there, they do tours and they do dyeing and explanatory things, which is great. We're highly recommended. So I'm going to just add it to the link on today's Daf post. Okay, so anyone who wants it, if you can't find it there, you can let us know and email us and we'll send it. But it definitely has a lot of information about different approaches, different Deod in the Rishonim, and there's a lot to be said there. Okay, plus pictures and all that. Okay, in the meantime, we're going to get started. Now, today, that's not really the main topic of what is techelet, okay? It will come up later, like what's the snail, what is it, what's its identification, and other sorts of things. We'll see over the next few days. Okay, התכלת אינה מעכבת את הלבן, והלבן אינו מעכב את התכלת. Okay, this Mishna assumes that you know all sorts of things, so we're going to talk about them right now, which are really going to come up with the Gemara, but I'll already explain. The pasuk says, and then we'll see it inside soon, but the pasuk says, we know this from Shema, okay, so speak to Bnei Israel and tell them, make tzitzit on the corners of their garments. V'natnu al tzitzit hakanaf petil techelet, and put on tzitzit the corner, okay, this is the word that's a little bit strange, petil techelet, okay, a string of techelet. Techelet means basically a wool dyed the color of techelet, which is a kind of blue shade. So now they're going to say the following. The drasha goes like this. Because it says the word hakanaf here, the corner, they learn here that you have to have strings, okay, besides the petil techelet, which are the strings at the end of the pasuk. When it says, Natnu al tzitzit hakanaf, put on tzitzit the corner, they say it has to be what we call min kanaf. You have to have threads that are also the same type as your beged, as your clothing. Meaning, if your garment is white, then you need white tzitzit. And most of the garments in those days were white. So, right, just like now, undershirts are white, right? So, for the most part. So, the garment has to have white tzitzit on them and techelet. And we're going to see even that because it's in this order, you have to put first white, then techelet. So basically, in tzitzit, there's 4 strings. You string them on, and then you fold. They basically get folded in half, and you end up with 8. Okay, but it really starts from 4 strings. So you need 2 white and 2 techelet, although there are different opinions, 1, 3, different, or half, some of them. Anyway, we're not going to get into all that, but the basic idea is you need white ones and you need techelet ones. So with this Mishnah, at least the simple reading of the Mishnah, you're going to see today, maybe we're going to have other readings. The simple reading of the Mishnah is, let's say you only have techelet strings, or you only have white strings. So even though the pasuk says you're supposed to have both, if you don't have both, it's fine. That's what it means. Techelet eina ma'akevet et halavan, halavan eino ma'akevet et techelet. You have techelet, it's fine even if you don't have white. If you have white, it's fine even if you don't have the techelet. Tefillah shel yad, okay, completely different halacha. Another thing that's not ma'akev. Remember, we're in the list right now, not like our previous list, of all the things that aren't essential or aren't necessary and don't ruin the other. Tefillah shel yad, tefillah means tefillin, not tefillah, but tefillin shel yad. Eina ma'akevet et shel rosh, v'shel rosh eina ma'akevet et shel yad. We actually discussed this in the tefillin sugya, which is that if you only have yad, it's fine. You can put on your tefillin shel yad. They're 2 separate mitzvot. If you don't do the Rosh, so you at least fulfill putting on the tefillin shel yad, and the reverse is true for the tefillin shel Rosh. Okay, but we're going to focus on the tzitzit today, and on this first line of techelet, eina ma'akevet halavan, halavan eino ma'akevet techelet. So the Gemara, and this is going to be the whole topic for today. Lema manitin de lo kerebi. Let us suggest. Now, whenever we have a let us suggest, usually it will be rejected, as it will be here, or at least potentially rejected. Okay, meaning we want to make a suggestion. And then basically we're going to end up saying it's not clear-cut that this is true. Okay, even though it looks pretty clear-cut that it's true. Lema manitin de lo kerebi. Seems like our Mishnah is not like Rebbe. Why is that? Ditanya, as it says in a Braita, Ureitem oto, milamed shema'akvin ze'etze, divrei Rebbe. Okay, the pasuk after the one I quoted, after it says this hakanaf, which means min kanaf, the type of, right, it has to be white, and then it says p'til techelet, then it says, vaya lachem l'tzitzit, these should be for you for tzitzit, ureitem oto, and you should see it. Now something's weird in that pasuk. Didn't we just say there's min kanaf and p'til techelet, there's white and the techelet? So it should be ureitem otam, them, not singular oto. So from here, we don't really know how yet, but from here, in a minute they're going to explain. From there, we learn they're ma'akvin ze'etzeh. You have to have both the lavan and the techelet. Now that goes completely against our Mishnah, and that's why they said, oh, it looks like our Mishnah's not like Rebbe. Okay, simple reading, it's really not like Rebbe. Okay, Chachamim omrim, they disagree. They say, ein ma'akvin. No, they're not ma'akev. Okay, so now first, before we get to anything else, we're just going to understand where did Rebbe get it from, how did he get it from that pasuk. And what's the reasoning behind the rabbis? My time of the Rebbe, dichtiv. Here we get to what I mentioned before. Ha-kanaf, min kanaf. That's the first drasha. Everybody accepts this. Ha-kanaf, again, is telling you it has to be, you have to have strings that are like the kanaf, like the clothing that you're wearing, like the shirt. Uchtiv petil techelet. Right? So you need white and you need techelet strings. Va'amar rachmana, and then the Torah said, uri'item oto. Singular, even though we were just talking about two. Ad ikat travaihu bechad. What does that mean? Why singular? You have to have both as one, meaning they're both essential. He views the fact that it switches to singular language to say they both have to be there as one, meaning you can't have the tzitzit without both. Rabbanan say the opposite. Uritem oto. Why is it in singular? Kol chad lechude mashma. It's singular because you could have just white, or you could have just techelet. Okay? And therefore the rabbis understand that means the opposite of what you think it means. Anyway, the point being, right, that lema de lo kirebi. The Gemara reminds us what we were up to here, which is, oh, this seems like it's not really like Rebbe. Okay? Because the Mishnah says you can have techelet without the white. You can have the white without the techelet. So from there it seems pretty clear the Mishnah goes against Rebbe. What we're going to do in the rest of the daf, for the most part, or most of the daf, is show two different possible explanations to how to read the Mishnah not in its simple reading, but yes, to have the Mishnah work together with Rebbe. Okay, first we'll have Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav, then at the very end of that whole explanation, Rav is going to reject it on one point, and then we're going to give Rav's explanation of how he reads the Mishnah according to Rebbe. And they're both going to take the Mishnah out of its simple reading, but the simple reading of the Mishnah is actually the halacha, which is that you don't need both. Where do we see this? Well, if you go into a regular store to buy tzitzit, most of them have only white strings, and they don't have techelet, right? It's only if you pay a lot more money and you get the special techelet and all that, and forget about all these generations where people couldn't even come up with what techelet was, and they couldn't find the dye, they couldn't figure it out. So basically, we would have been stuck with no way to do the mitzvah of tzitzit. So you see, it was good this halacha was the halacha because it allowed people to have tzitzit without needing the techelet there. So that is the way we read, but we're still going, that's the way we read the Mishnah, the simple reading, and we pass in that way, but we are still going to try to fit the Mishnah into Rebbe as well. So Amar Rav Yehuda, here's our first attempt. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Afelu Tema Rebbe, Lo Nitzracha Ela Lekadem. What it means, okay, now look at the pasuk. The pasuk starts off with the min kanaf and moves to the techelet. So they take it literally that it needs to be first white, then techelet. So when you're putting in the strings, first put the white strings, then put the techelet ones. And what the Mishnah is telling us is, lo nitzracha, the Mishnah wasn't needed other than likadem, which means what? If you did it the reverse order, that wouldn't be essential, okay? It's fine. So better to do it in the right order, white then blue. But if you did, or techelet, let's call it, because it's not exactly blue. But if you put it in, I mean, it's a blue shade, but it's not any blue shade, so we're going to just call it techelet. So if you put techelet before the lavan, before the white, it's fine. That's what the Mishnah is telling you. Okay, you're going to see there's a major problem with this. Maybe I'll catch it right now, maybe you won't, but I'm going to start reading a Braita that shows this, Titania. So it's not just we're making this up, that this is the case, that if you don't do it that way, it's okay. Well, look, there's a Braita that says exactly that. And then we could say, maybe that's what our Mishnah is saying. Mitzvah lahakdim lavan l'techelet. Okay, ideally, it's a mitzvah to put the white first before the techelet. Ve'im hikdim techelet lelavan yatsa. Now, if you did the techelet before the lavan, you're yotze, you fulfill your obligation. Ela shechiser mitzvah. But you're missing a mitzvah. Okay, what does that mean? The Gemara wants to understand what does that mean. My chiser mitzvah, what does that mean? Turning out on a bed. Okay, so it's a very short daf today. Now, if you want to explain the Mishnah in this way, based on this Breita, and you want to say that this fits with Rebbe, well, this definitely can't. If you say the chiser mitzvah means you didn't fulfill the mitzvah of the white strings. Okay? In other words, let's imagine, okay, this is just a suggestion, that it means if you put the white before the blue, before the techelet, that's the way to do it. But if you started with techelet and then put the white ones at the end, you would fulfill your mitzvah of techelet, of putting techelet in your tzitzit, but you wouldn't fulfill the mitzvah of putting the white ones in, meaning we view the white ones as if they're not there. Well, if that's the case, then in other words, because we have to figure out, it says yatsa, you fulfilled something, but you also didn't fulfill something. So it's like when you do +2, -2, right? You basically added and detracted, and then you're at neutral. But this doesn't really make any sense, because if you say, right, we have to have it adding something and detracting something that's not completely detracting. So it must be saying, and it's, again, this is a suggestion which is no way going to work. What they're suggesting is maybe it means you fulfilled the mitzvah of techelet, you didn't fulfill the mitzvah of white, of the min kanaf. But if you didn't fulfill the mitzvah of the white, what does Rebbe hold? Im ein, right? If the techelet and the lavan are ma'akvin ze'etzeh. So if you don't fulfill the lavan, then you don't fulfill the techelet either. So the Rebbe yikuvim ma'akve adade. So it definitely can't be that, because they're essential. You need both. So you can't possibly say that if you did it out of order, you fulfilled techelet, you didn't fulfill the white. Okay? That can't be. So therefore, we have to come up with a different explanation for what does it mean that yatsa but chiser mitzvah. So Amar Rav Yehud Amar Rav, the same Rav Yehud Amar Rav who brought this as a suggestion that this is, that we could explain the Mishnah like this, explain the following. Shechiser mitzvah ve'asa mitzvah. Okay, that didn't really help us yet. You missed a mitzvah and you fulfilled the mitzvah. Okay, so what does that mean? My chiser mitzvah de lo avad mitzvah min hamuvchar. You didn't do the mitzvah in the ideal manner. Okay, it's not that we get you to neutral, right? You got one thing and you lost one thing and you're at 0. No. You did the mitzvah. You fulfilled your mitzvah. You could put a check. But you get like an A-. Okay? You didn't do the mitzvah in the best way possible. The best way is put the white, then put the techelet. You did it the reverse order. Fine. You're wearing tzitzit. We're going to count it as a mitzvah. But it's not the ideal way of doing it. Okay. Now let's go back. What we're basically saying is, and now we're going to see the major problem with this approach. It says that techelet eina ma'akevet et halavan, v'halavan eino ma'akevet et techelet. Now, how do we read this? We read it as the techelet. If you put techelet first, it's not preventing the mitzvah of the lavan, right? You can still put the lavan second and still fulfill your mitzvah. That works. What about the next line? Halavan eino ma'akevet et techelet. What does that mean? If you put the lavan first, it doesn't prevent the techelet it doesn't fulfill you from fulfilling the mitzvah of the techelet. What could that possibly mean? That's the ideal way to do it. It doesn't make any sense according to this. This only makes sense in one direction, and the Mishnah gives 2 directions. And that's what the Gemara is going to say right now. Hatinach, so hatinach means this works. Halavan eino ma'akevet techelet. Okay, so it works to say, sorry, I said it the opposite. The lavan eino ma'akevet techelet means if you did the techelet first. That's the sentence that works. I said it the opposite. Every time I read this, because you can read it different ways. Lavan eino ma'akevet techelet, meaning if you did the lavan second, it doesn't ruin your mitzvah of the techelet, meaning you can, right, if you did the techelet first, you could still get the mitzvah. But techelet eina ma'akevet lavan ma'i. But how do you read that line? Techelet eina ma'akevet lavan. That, how would you read it? Okay, because again, that means it sounds like you did the lavan first and then the techelet, and that's the ideal way. So there's no reason to say, oh, well, there's no problem. Of course there's no problem. That's the ideal way to do it. So, Amarami Barchama lo nitzracha ela letalit shekula techelet. What does he say? Now, in a mitzvah, you have to understand one thing, which is if you have a garment that's completely techelet, what do? You don't put on only techelet, even though you would say, oh, min kanaf is techelet, and then it says in this pasuk, min kanaf and then add techelet. So maybe you would think all 4 tzitziot are techelet. No. What you do then is you do techelet and lavan. And now what's going to be the order? In other words, there they learn, since the lavan needs lavan and techelet, so the techelet needs techelet and lavan as well. Okay? They basically come to this conclusion that must be a package. By the way, it doesn't have to be lavan. If your clothing is some other color, then it's that color. Okay? That's why I said that normally they were white, but it could be any color. Now, what they say is like this. In a talit shekulat techelet, the assumption is that the order is reversed. First, you do the min kanaf, the techelet, and then you do the lavan after. Okay, that's an assumption they have to make this make sense. And then that line that we didn't understand, techelet in ama kevet et lavan, is basically saying, in a beged that's all techelet, if you put the lavan first, it wouldn't ruin the mitzvah of the techelet. You could still fulfill the mitzvah of the techelet, even though you did it out of order. Okay, now, what we're going to do in this next section is starts with an itmar nami. This was said also, and we're basically going to review exactly what we just said. Just say it and somebody else said this. And then again, this is a way to read. Okay, it's a discussion that Levi had with Shmuel about this, and you're going to see they're going to say the exact same thing. So it's just good review. Amar le Levi l'Shmuel. Levi goes over to Shmuel and he says, Aryoch, you lion, which basically means king. Like, I have a lot of respect for you. Lo teita b'karich ad mefarshet li laha milta. You are not going to sit down or don't sit on your feet until you tell me the following, explain to me the following thing. He quotes our Mishnah, and he understands the Mishnah the way Rav Yehuda said in the name of Rav. Maihi, how do we explain this? Amar lei, lo nitzra. So first he just says, how do we explain the Mishnah? And Shmuel says to him exactly what Rav said. Okay, Rav Yehuda quoted Rav as saying, lo nitzra ela l'sadim b'tzitzit. Okay, we're talking about a sadin, a white garment with tzitzit. De mitzvah lagdume lavan bereisha. You're supposed to put the white in first. My timer, what's the reason? Now we're just reviewing everything we saw in this section. Ha kanaf min kanaf. It says the corner. From there they learn it has to be a string like the beged itself. Vi akdim techelet lelavan late lamba. And if you put the techelet first, there's no problem. So now, it sounds like probably Levi responded, or it's just the Gemara responding, but it sounds like Levi responded. Tinach lavan deino makevet techelet. I get the sentence how you read lavan is not makevet techelet. But techelet deina makevet lavan mahi. Complete review, right? What do you do with that line? That line seems to say, if you put the lavan first, it doesn't ruin the mitzvah of techelet, putting the techelet, but that's exactly the way to do it. So, of course, it wouldn't ruin it. It's exactly doing it the right way. Amar le, Rami, Amar, so it shouldn't be Amar le, it should be Amar Rami Barchama. So he quotes him, Rami Barchama, Lo nitzracha ela letalit shekula techelet. De mitzvah lakdume techelet bereisha. Deha kanaf min kanaf v'akim lavan bereisha late lamba. So it's meant for a talit that's all techelet, that the mitzvah there is the reverse. Put the techelet first, then the white, because ha kanaf min kanaf. And therefore, you should start with the one that's that tight, meaning start with the techelet, and i akdim lavan bereisha late lamba. If you put the lavan first, there's no problem. And that must be what the Mishnah is talking about. That was a complete review. There was nothing new in there. It was just that this discussion happened also somewhere else. There's a few things not clear about this. First of all, some people actually take out Rami Bar Chama from the answer in the first section and just have him here. There's also, it's unclear, like I said, is the whole second part of that discussion Levi and Shmuel, or is it the Gemara talking? Anyway, that's not so critical. The content means the same thing, which is we came up with a way to explain this. But here comes Rav's difficulty, and because of that, Rav is going to start with a whole different explanation. Amar Rava, midi tziva kagarim? Does the color of the garment, that is what determines the order in which you do it? And as I get when you have a lavan beged, so kanaf, min kanaf, put the white first, then it says p'til techelet, so put the techelet second. But in a beged of techelet, where there's a whole drasha anyway, like it's not even so clear. And from there we get that you're also supposed to have, not only with your techelet, you're supposed to have white also. But who says you're supposed to switch the order of how you do it? It's always put the white, then the techelet. Also notice techelet comes at the end of the pasuk. And he basically says it's not the color of the garment that determines what the order is supposed to be. The order is the way the pasuk says. White, again, assuming min kanaf is white, And there's only this drasha that gets you to, well, if it's techelet, we're going to do techelet also, but that's not really what the pasuk is referring to. It should be the white and the techelet. So it doesn't really make sense to him that the reverse is true as well, that the techelet has to go first on a beged shekula techelet, that's all techelet, and therefore that interpretation doesn't really work, according to Rava, with the Mishnah, because the Mishnah is bidirectional, and this does not fit with two directions, because he thinks in all cases Lavan goes first. So Rava could just say, okay, so the Mishnah is not like Rebbe, because remember, that's why we're here. This was all a creative, so to speak, explanation of the Mishnah. Now, it's not so crazy because the Braita does say it, but to try to basically, the problem with this though is it really only worked for half very well. The other half was a bit of a kvetch, and Rava doesn't really go with the kvetch because he doesn't think it's true. So Rava's going to give his own explanation as to how we could still work our Mishnah with Rebbe. It means something else completely, and then it will work with Rebbe. So Amarava. So Rava brings his own explanation. Lo nisracha ela legardumim, which we talked about. What if you have little strands left? Meaning you tied your tzitzit, you had the strings, everything was fine, and then they ripped, and you're left with a very short bit of string. Now, so what's the techelet in Lavan? What does that have to do with techelet? Eina ma'akevet Lavan. Lavan eino ma'akevet techelet. Di'i igardem techelet v'kai Lavan. If your techelet ones rip and you're left with just a very small amount and you have your white ones, or the reverse, there's no problem. Okay? So the fact that you have nice white tzitziot, but not techelet ones, they're just little strands there, or scraps, you could call them, right? There's just a little bit left. Or the reverse, and that goes in both directions, so that works much better. Then it doesn't ruin your tzitzit. The fact that you have nice white ones or nice techelet ones, but the other ones are ruined, it's fine. As long as there's a little bit, we'll get to what exact shiur you need for a little bit. Okay? So that's what it comes to mean. Now, they're going to say, how do I know this? Da'amre b'nei Rabbi Chia, and he quotes the sons of Rabbi Chia, who he quoted previously, who say, Gardumei techelet kshirim. Okay, the gardumim of techelet are fine. And gardumei ezov kshirim. Okay, that's irrelevant to our purposes, but for the para aduma, if you have a small amount of a twig, it's fine. But the point is, he says, well, where do we learn this? In the tefillin. Remember the ritzuot there, right? Gardumim are not okay because they're tashmishe kedusha, and this is just tashmishe mitzvah, which is a lesser sanctity, and therefore the gardumim are okay. So gardumei techelet are fine, gardumei ezov are also fine. Point being, that based on that, we can explain our Mishnah that we're talking about gardumim. So if you have gardumim of one color and the other ones are fine, that's one is not going to ruin the other, meaning it's fine to have it like that. Okay. The kama shiur gardumim. So now we're just going to get off a little bit on this. What is the shiur? Amar bar hamduri amar Shmuel kedei la'anvan, enough to tie a knot in them. Okay, they have to be long enough that you could tie a knot. Now we're going to have a question about this knot. Ibailu, kedela anvan kule ba'adade. Do we mean you have to be able to tie them all to each other? Meaning, I'm not exactly sure what they mean here, but I guess probably it needs to be a little longer if you want to tie around each other. Some people think we're talking about just 2. Some people think we're talking about all the 8. In other words, remember, it's 4, but they turn into 8, and that you need to be able to tie it around all 8 of them, which would be a little bit longer. Or we just mean, right, if you take a knot, like if you're sewing, right, and you make a little knot at the end so it doesn't come through. So just a knot in the, right, on itself. Maybe it's just enough, long enough that you can make a little knot there. Okay, that's the shiur. So we're not exactly sure what the range is. What we know what the range is basically, but we don't know exactly which one, if it is one to itself or. And the answer is take. We don't have an answer to that particular question, but we know it's enough to make a knot. By Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi now asks a question, which sounds like a bit of a Rabbi Yirmiyah question. Alime delome anve. What if they're very thick? Now, a very thick string you can't make a knot with, right? It's very hard to make a knot with a very thick string. But what if it was the length that I haviktine ma'anve? If it was very thin, you would be able to make a knot in it. Okay, so let's say we say, it's 1 inch, okay? And this is 1 inch long, but you couldn't tie a knot with the 1 inch. So, do we say, this is like, remember the whole sugya with rowing? We view the wine as if it's water, we view the water as if it's wine, we view the string as if it's thin, and if you can make a knot, then it would work. Do we say that? Amar le Rav Acha b'rei de Rav Ashi. So Rav Acha comes to answer Rav Ashi, kol shekain de min kar mitzvatayu. Of course, yes, it will work. Because this is even much more noticeable because it's thick. So in other words, what's the idea? We want it to be noticeable. You have tzitziot there. If it's very thin and very short, right, it's not going to be noticeable. So if it's long enough that if it were thin, it would be good, then even though, right, to tie it is just really a way of saying, I'm just throwing out 1 inch, okay, or 3 centimeters, whatever it is, right? So it's just we just want a shear so it's noticeable. And if it's thick, it's much more noticeable. So yes, that would work. Okay, we have 2 small things we're going to do, and then we finish the daf. Uman Tana de Palagale de Rebbe. So the first thing they want to know is, who is the Tana who disagrees with Rebbe? It's Rebbe against Chachamim. Now you could just say it's the Chachamim, but I guess they know somebody said this and they want to quote it by name. Did Tanya, Rabbi Yitzchak Omer Mishum Rabbi Natan, Shamar Mishum Rabbi Yosef Glili, Shamar Mishum Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. So we have this one quoting that one, quoting that one, quoting that one, getting all the way back to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Ein lo techelet matia lavan. If you don't have techelet, you put lavan. And that's what I said before, right? That we hold by. So that's the one who holds like Rebbe, who holds against Rebbe, because he clearly holds you don't need the techelet, whereas Rebbe said the techelet is essential. Okay. Plus, he also thinks the white ones are essential. But here you see somebody who says if you don't have techelet, you can wear lavan, and that's Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Okay. Amar Rava. Now Rava goes back to the Bnei Rabbi Chia, and he says the Bnei Rabbi Chia said that gardumim are ksherim. Okay, for this it would be helpful to look at a pair of tzitzit, okay, or look at a photo, okay, and the way that tzitzit work, and we're going to talk about this much more tomorrow, and then the link I'm going to send you to Patil Techelet, you can find some pictures there. What you do at tzitzit is so you strand around the 4 strings, you put them around, then you tie a knot, then you start these sivuvim, we call them, or, okay, you take 1 string and you put it around, you make these round circles around the 8 here. Julie's showing us. Then you tie a knot. Then you do it again. Then you tie a knot. You do it again. You tie a knot. You do it again 4 times. Every time in between is called a chuliyah. The end of each chuliyah, there's a whole, tomorrow we're going to get into how many times you have to wrap it around each time. Okay, we'll get to that. Then there's a knot at the end of each one. And then you have the strings that hang down loosely. Okay, so you have knot at the top, right? Chuliyah, knot. Chuliyah, knot. Chuliyah, knot. Chuliyah, knot. Okay, and we make these double knots so that they don't come out. Now comes Rav, and he's going to basically say this all comes from the Bnei Rabbi Chia, this need for the knots in all the places. Why? He says, Shma mina tzarich likshor al kol chuliyah uchuliyah. You have to make a double knot, like a strong knot at the end of each one. Why? Now what happens if you have a teeny little strand? What's going to happen? It's going to unravel, right? So he says the following. If you think you don't need to make double knots at the end of each of these chuliyot with all the strings going around, okay, we didn't need to quote the ezov part, it's irrelevant. But the fact that Bnei Rabbi Chia said, right, so if you think you don't need to make a knot, when the Bnei Rabbi Chia said they're ksherim, kevan de ishtre le ilai, if you undo if the top one gets undone. Now, top one is tricky. Okay, we really mean the bottom one. Why they call it the top? So when the tzitzit are on, right, it's the one at the bottom. After you do all the chuliyot, it's that bottom one. But when you pick up the tzitzit and hold it in your hand, it becomes at the top, and that's why they seem to call it the top one. Now that's where the gardumim come out of, that last knot at the bottom. Now, if you have just a little string, that knot could easily get undone. And if that knot gets undone and you didn't put double knots at the end of all the chuliyot, what's going to happen? The entire thing is going to unravel. Ishtere le kula. So it must be the fact that they think gardumim are allowed, and gardumim are basically, let's say it like this, they're prone to unraveling. It must be that, and you need the chuliyot, you need those 4 sections. It must be that you have to make a knot at the end of each section. Otherwise, the whole thing would come unraveled. To which the Gemara rejects, we'll just start the first 2 words of tomorrow's daf because it's just ending this sugya. Dilma de iktar. Maybe Bnei Rabbi Chia, when they said that gardume techelet ksherim, maybe they meant only if you tied them. And as Rava wanted to say, they say gardume ksherim, he understood that as they're always permitted, meaning you must have knots because otherwise they would never have permitted them. But the suggestion of the Gemara to reject this assumption of Rava is maybe you don't have to tie the knots. And the Bnei Rabbi Chia were saying, if you have a little teeny bit left, it'll be okay, assuming that you did make the knots, but not that you have to make the knots. And then gardumek shirim are only going to be some of the time, assuming you made knots in all the sections. If you didn't make knots in all the sections, then we're not going to do gardumim for some other reason, right? Not because it's not respectable. No, it's fine. A little bit is fine, but the whole thing could unravel, so we're not going to allow it then in that case. Okay, there ends our daf, so let's just do a quick review. We've brought the second story of Rav Ashi about how exactly it came about. In the end, the conclusion is really the same, which is the Gemara here seems to be accepting this parshanut of Rav Bar Shva, of that comment about gadol kevod haberiyot techelet lo tasur b'Torah, that it doesn't really techelet lo tasur b'Torah. It overrides a derabanan, and that comes from the Torah, the lo taseh of lo tasur. Don't veer from what the rabbis taught you. Then we got to this Mishna. Techelet is not makev the lavan, lavan is not makev the techelet, and about the tefillin shel yad and tefillin shel Rosh. We immediately said, oh, it sounds like the Mishnah is not like Rebbe, because Rebbe said they're not right, that they are makev. You need lavan and techelet. If you don't have both, right, from uritem oto, after the kanaf min kanaf and the ptil techelet. And then it says in singular, you need them both, even though the rabbis didn't read it that way. He thinks you need them both, but we have Rav Yehuda Rav, who said, no, it really means the order is not ma'akev. Of course you need them both, but the order is not essential. We had a bit of a problem with the second part, right? Actually, the first line, techelet ina ma'akev talavan. That didn't seem to work. They said, well, maybe that's in a beged shekul of techelet, which seemed to work for most people, but Rava didn't like it. So Rava gave a different explanation, how to explain the Mishnah according to Rebbe, and said the Mishnah is really talking about if you have just a drop of the techelet left or a drop of the lavan left, that doesn't ruin your tzitzit. Okay, you have regular lavan and a drop of techelet, or regular techelet and a drop of lavan. That's fine, and that's what the Mishnah means. It goes in both directions. There's a bit of a weakness with that interpretation, because what if you have strands of all of them? That should work also. So it's not so clear. Then we got into, well, how long do they need to be? Enough to make a knot. We had some discussions about the knots. And then from there, we basically said, oh, who disagrees with Rebbe, by the way? Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. And then we ended up with this one last thing that Rava derives from Bnei Rabbi Chia, about these knots in the tzitzit. You must have knots after each kuliyah. Otherwise, if you would allow gardumim, the whole thing would unravel. But the Gemara rejects the possibility, because say maybe Bnei Rabbi Chia only permitted it when you did the knots, but not necessarily that you have to do the knots. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day and a Chodesh Tov.